Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we've been talking about in terms of Black Marxism, especially in the context of the upcoming water resolution. I want to particularly talk about the Black Marxism critique and the way that policy teams respond to the Black Marxism critique. If you haven't, I would definitely check out the intro to Black Marxism and water, and also the first two parts that I did talking about Black Marxism and water and the way that I think that critical teams can go for this type of argument against policy teams. Because I think if you are a policy team that's trying to figure out how to answer this type of criticism, getting a clear understanding of the types of arguments that the other team wants to make in order to establish their offense and put themselves in a comfortable place is really important for how you make your strategy. And if you're a team that is trying to learn how to execute the strategy, then tuning into these next couple of videos and the last couple of videos that I did are definitely both helpful places for you to figure out what are the best things for you to focus on and think about and keep in mind as you're really trying to create a really coherent strategy against this particular type of argument. I think that it's really important to think about and consider the way in which your affirmatives are really answering the question of racial capitalism, because I think that a lot of the central kind of like claims and thesis arguments that it's making, you're going to have to answer against a lot of criticisms on the resolution. And so being clean on the questions that it's really offering is definitely important. And in this video, I kind of want to begin by kind of talking about what I think some of the priorities are versus it and what you should be mainly thinking about in terms of maybe some of the strengths and weaknesses of that argument. And then thinking about what are some of the kind of like framing and thesis questions that you should be using in order to frame a lot of what are the like more contextual to flow type of arguments that I'll be making and explaining later on in the next video. And to start this one off, I think that when you're generally trying to figure out what your priorities are when debating against this type of argument, I think the first place that you want to figure out is how do you want to contest with the alternative. I think that it's really important to figure out how the alternative is competing with the affirmative and whether or not it is attempting to make a stance on the materiality question of the affirmative, because I think that changes the type of direction that you might want to take things, like what type of link turn arguments you make and how you really want to develop the impact debate later on. A lot of the ways that I'm going to be thinking about how you want to like take on some of these strategies, I want to mainly decide between like strategies that are more developed to take like a soft left route in terms of like taking head on the questions of racial capitalism and policy's role and being able to like resolve structural injustice as a result of that, and then something that's like closer to like a harder right kind of like pivoting against this type of strategy, which is based much more on just being able to weigh kind of like the existential question of like what the kind of like water crisis does in terms of how we think about like environmental crises, the economy, etc. All questions that kind of lead to these maybe bigger extinction level impact questions that I think can kind of like weigh heavily on how you're doing the impact debate. But I think ultimately it really becomes a question of how can you really frame a lot of these questions in a way that even if you're kind of matching the team that's reading the capitalism argument or reading Black Marxism on the question of like scale, how do you kind of like win arguments at the level of like efficiency and the particular role and necessity of policy, and thinking about like the how we kind of make radical change in the way that the alternative is suggesting, and the role in which you're able to kind of win that you're like kind of meta framing questions for the debate are also kind of allowing you to win like reasons why there are like worlds in which the affirmative is necessary for the alternative to be able to kind of like resolve or come to terms with or be able to like open up space for the possibility of black radical resistance, etc. And I think that kind of being able to really focus and figure out where your affirmative can kind of find its place in there if you want to take like a soft left strategy is definitely a really important skill to get in order to really make specific and precise answers to this type of argument. And I think that on the other side, if you're a team that really just wants to kind of push like the power of the kind of like normative impact comparison that you want to hold, it's still really important to bring out the preciseness in terms of the scale of your affirmative and resolving like key questions about like just the existence of like life on earth and how that kind of relates to like the ability of the alternative to be able to manifest itself, which is kind of a different manifestation of the same type of skills that I was talking about before. When I'm thinking generally about what some of the framing kind of questions should be and how you should be just like basing the framework portion of this debate, I think that you definitely can read a lot of the normative stuff that you would read in terms of your interpretation and wanting the consequences of the affirmative to be weighed. But I think early on you really want to explain the value of policy scenario planning in terms of how we think about like things like environmentalism and like the evolution of capitalism. I think that you need to make a lot of arguments about like if the that kind of concede that if the negative is right about how kind of deep deeply steep capitalism is in politics, that there it kind of like requires the usage of like politics at a certain point to open up space for like the presence of black radical resistance, because of the like various ways in which those forms of like violence can only be undone by like basically opening up space for like various types of like intervention from movements, etc. And I think that opening up a lot of arguments about like various types of uses of like policy scenario planning for how we at least weigh impacts and make political decisions, and like key contention for like why for how the judge should kind of be making decisions and what their ballot can do, can really go a long way in terms of making your frame your arguments on this page. Just at least set fundamental basis for competition against the other team, and also at least hold them to a standard where even if they're able to kind of like push maybe some of these more ideological link arguments, that they're not really able to raise to the level of just refuting the negative on base value just because of whatever like representation or epistemological value you hold, because a lot of the arguments that you're making are based in just like the consequential analysis of the affirmative, which I think is like a much better place for you to be situating how you want the judge to be resolving a lot of the questions in the debate, comparatively to like whether or not there is like any investment of capitalism in the 1AC, because I think that's just a hard line to hold yourself to in terms of how the judge should evaluate your arguments. This means that when you get to like the thesis level portion of the debate, a lot of the arguments that I think that you can start making that kind of like feed and move off of the framing arguments that you made before are just arguments about whether or not they're kind of right about the innate like relationship that the state has to capitalism, that the policy as a particular like tool of how we like use the state, refuse it, and like open up like gaps within it is like a necessary like particular type of like a strategic vantage point that like we have to be able to at least understand in order to be able to like refuse it at some capacity. And so being able to like gain and garner that knowledge through being able to like position and talk through the kind of like ways in which the affirmative kind of develops various political strategies is like important. I think that being able to invest time on why that type of framing for the debate kind of moves away from the standard of like whether or not the 1AC requires the usage of any capitalist institution, and is more about the idea of like how the 1AC uses that institution and what capacity does it feed into the possibility of different types of like resistance, etc. I think that if you can do this in order to make early kind of explanations of and examples that are historically supported to show the way in which the types of mechanisms that the affirmative is taking up, it opens up the possibility for radical resistance in different capacities, especially ones that are really able to attend to things like racial justice in the face of capitalism, have a really good like jump start on being able to answer what I think are going to end up being some of the core kind of controversies for this criticism as a whole. Hopefully this video was helpful for you in order for you to think about like how a policy team's respond to this argument as a whole, and how you should be responding to this argument if that's what you want to do, or learning about how other teams will respond to the argument that you're reading. And yeah, hopefully you'll tune in for more in order to understand more from the next video. Thanks.